The 5th of June 1942 brought devastating news that echoed through the halls of the United States Navy Department in Washington. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, American forces had just secured a miraculous victory at Midway. Yet the brutal reality remained undeniable. The Navy's frontline fighter, the Grumman F6F Wildcat, was being systematically outmatched by Japan's formidable Mitsubishi A6M0. In the sweltering Pacific theater, young American pilots were dying in cockpits of aircraft that couldn't climb fast enough, turn tight enough, or accelerate quickly enough to counter their enemies' advantages. The carrier decks were launching brave men into machines that demanded superhuman skill just to survive an encounter with the nimble Japanese fighters. Robert Hall, a 23-year-old ensign from Iowa, had recently returned from the Coral Sea engagement with stories that chilled even the most decorated commanders. He described watching his wingman spiral into the ocean after a Zero executed a climbing turn that the Wildcat simply couldn't follow. The enemy aircraft seemed to float through the sky, while American fighters clawed desperately for altitude, their Pratt & Whitney engines screaming in protest. These accounts weren't isolated incidents, but represented a dangerous pattern emerging across every carrier task force in the Pacific. The United States possessed industrial might and determination, but without air superiority over the fleet, those advantages meant little against a determined and experienced enemy. At the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation facility in Bethpage, New York, a team of engineers led by chief designer Leroy Grumman had been anticipating this crisis since before Pearl Harbor. They understood that evolution in aerial combat wasn't gradual, it came in revolutionary leaps. The company had already begun development on a successor to the Wildcat in June 1941, 6 months before America even entered the war. This foresight would prove invaluable as the project accelerated under wartime urgency. The design team worked 8-hour days, fueled by coffee and the weight of knowing that American lives depended on their slide rules and blueprints. According to archived reports from the Grumman Historical Center, the engineering philosophy centered on one uncompromising principle: create a fighter that could absorb punishment, deliver devastating firepower, and outperform any adversary in the combat conditions actually encountered over the Pacific. The aircraft taking shape in those classified design rooms bore little resemblance to its predecessor beyond the distinctive Grumman profile. Engineers specified a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Wildcat's output. The airframe would be larger, heavier, and paradoxically more agile than the aircraft it replaced. 650 caliber Browning machine guns would provide unprecedented firepower, capable of shredding enemy aircraft with a single sustained burst. Most critically, the design incorporated hard-learned lessons written in the blood of carrier pilots: armor protections surrounding the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb enemy rounds without erupting into flames, and structural reinforcement that could withstand carrier landings even after sustaining battle damage. The prototype, designated F6F-1, represented more than engineering excellence, it embodied America's emerging philosophy of warfare through overwhelming technological and industrial superiority, combined with practical battlefield wisdom. The 26th of June 1942 witnessed the XF6F-1 prototype lifting off from Grumman's runway for its maiden flight. Piloted by test aviator Robert Halla, different man from the Iowa ensign, but equally dedicated to his craft. The aircraft responded to controls with surprising grace, considering its substantial weight of over 15,000 pounds fully loaded. Hall pushed the prototype through a series of aggressive maneuvers that would have torn the wings off lesser designs, and the Hellcat, it was already being called, internally absorbed every stress with mechanical indifference. The double wasp engine roared with authority, propelling the fighter to speeds exceeding 375 miles per hour in level flight, a significant improvement over the Wildcat's maximum velocity. Navy test pilots descended on Bethpage throughout the summer and autumn of 1942, putting the developing fighter through increasingly demanding evaluations. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient for his heroic defense of the carrier Lexington, spent hours in the cockpit providing feedback that shaped final design modifications. He particularly praised the fighter's stability as a gun platform, the heavy airframe, absorbed recoil from all 6 machine guns firing simultaneously, allowing pilots to maintain accurate aim during extended bursts. This characteristic would prove decisive in the desperate air battles to come. O'Hara's detailed reports, preserved in Naval Aviation Archives, emphasize that the Hellcat gave average pilots a fighting chance against expert enemies, while transforming exceptional pilots into nearly unstoppable aerial predators. Production contracts arrived with remarkable speed as the Navy recognized they had discovered their answer to Japanese air superiority. Grumman received orders for hundreds of aircraft before the type had even completed official acceptance trials. The Bethpage facility transformed into a 24-hour manufacturing operation, with women and men working rotating shifts to meet impossible deadlines. By January 1943, F6F Hellcats began rolling off assembly lines at a rate that would eventually reach over 500 aircraft per month at peak production. This industrial achievement reflected America's greatest strategic advantage, the capacity to produce superior equipment in overwhelming quantities while simultaneously training pilots to employ it effectively. The first operational squadron to receive Hellcats was Fighting Squadron 9, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey, embarked aboard the carrier Essex. The pilots transitioned from Wildcats to Hellcats during January and February 1943. Learning the new fighter's capabilities through intensive training flights over the Atlantic, the Hellcat demanded different techniques than its predecessor. It was faster in the dive, could sustain higher speeds in level flight, and possessed energy retention that allowed pilots to execute multiple attack passes without losing the speed advantage. Most importantly, it could finally match the zero-in climb rate, eliminating the deadly disadvantage that had cost so many lives during the war's early months. The 30th of August, 1943, marked the Hellcat's combat debut during raids against Marcus Island, a small Japanese-held atoll lying nearly 1,000 miles southeast of Tokyo. Fighting Squadron 9 launched from Essex with 36 Hellcats. Their Pratt & Whitney engines synchronized in a thunderous roar that vibrated through the carrier's steel deck. The formation climbed steadily toward 20,000 feet, pilots scanning the brilliant Pacific sky for enemy interceptors. The Marcus Island strike encountered determined resistance from a mixed force of Japanese Navy fighters attempting to defend the isolated garrison. Lieutenant David McCampbell, leading a division of 4 Hellcats, spotted 6 Zeros climbing aggressively toward the American formation. The tactical situation that had spelled disaster for Wildcat pilots 9 months earlier now played out with dramatically different results. McCampbell led his division into a slashing diving attack that exploited the Hellcat's superior speed and structural strength. The American fighters plummeted through the enemy formation at over 400 miles per hour, far exceeding the Zero's recommended maximum dive speed. The engagement lasted 7 minutes of violent maneuvering across 30,000 feet of vertical airspace. McCampbell's Hellcat absorbed several 7.7mm rounds from a Zero that attempted a desperate stern attack, but the bullets merely punched neat holes through the rugged airframe without affecting flight characteristics. In contrast, when McCampbell aligned his gunsight pipper on a Zero and pressed the trigger, the concentrated firepower from 650 caliber machine guns literally shredded the lightweight Japanese fighter. Pieces of aluminum skin and structural components separated from the enemy aircraft before it rolled inverted and tumbled toward the ocean, trailing smoke and flames. This pattern repeated across the engagement area as Fighting Squadron 9 demonstrated the Hellcat's combat superiority. The Americans destroyed 11 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with another 4 probably destroyed, while losing only 2 Hellcats. Both pilots were recovered by submarine. The after-action reports from Marcus Island circulated rapidly through the Pacific Fleet, generating enormous enthusiasm among carrier air groups still flying the obsolete Wildcat. According to documentation preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida Carrier Division commanders immediately began requesting accelerated Hellcat deliveries for their squadrons. The aircraft represented more than improved performance specifications. It embodied hope that American pilots could finally meet their enemies on equal or superior terms. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Pilots who had spent months flying defensively now trained to fight aggressively, exploiting advantages rather than compensating for disadvantages. Throughout the autumn of 1943, additional carrier air groups transitioned to Hellcats while pushing westward across the Central Pacific. In fleet operations supporting the Gilbert Islands campaign, Fighting Squadron 2 embarked aboard Enterprise, received their aircraft in September, and immediately began the complex process of integrating the new fighter into established tactical doctrines. Commander James Flatley, the air group commander, recognized that the Hellcat's capabilities demanded revised tactical thinking, developed a formation fighting doctrine that emphasized coordinated attacks by divisions maintaining mutual support while exploiting the Hellcat's energy advantages. Pilots practiced these tactics relentlessly during transit toward the combat zone, executing simulated engagements until the maneuvers became instinctive reactions rather than conscious decisions. The 20th of November, 1943, brought the next major test as American carriers launched massive strikes against Tarawa and Makin atolls in the Gilbert Islands chain. Japanese defenders had reinforced these garrisons with substantial air units, including veteran pilots transferred from frontline combat zones. The resulting air battles developed into the largest carrier-based engagement since Midway, with over 200 aircraft swirling through the tropical sky above the invasion beaches. Fighting Squadron 2 encountered a formation of 18 Zeros attacking American torpedo bombers attempting to strike Japanese shipping in the Tarawa Lagoon. The Hellcat pilots dove into the enemy formation with textbook precision, their coordinated attacks fragmenting Japanese cohesion within seconds. The Battle of Tarawa established patterns that would characterize Pacific air combat for the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Alexander Vrotu, flying from the carrier Independence, personally destroyed 4 Zeros during a single engagement lasting less than 10 minutes. His combat report described the Hellcat's advantages with technical precision, superior dive speed allowed American pilots to engage or disengage at will. Heavy firepower meant that brief firing opportunities produced devastating results, and robust construction permitted aggressive maneuvering without fear of structural failure. These factors combined to fundamentally alter the tactical balance that had favored Japanese pilots during the war's opening phase. By January 1944, the Fast Carrier Task Force under Admiral Mark Mitcher had become the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. With Hellcats constituting the primary fighter component across all embarked air groups, the fleet prepared for Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands, which would require neutralizing Japanese air power across a 1,000-mile front. Carrier admirals planned to employ Hellcats not merely defensively protecting the fleet, but offensively sweeping enemy airfields and destroying Japanese aircraft before they could threaten American forces. This aggressive philosophy represented a complete reversal from the defensive posture necessitated by inferior equipment during earlier campaigns. The 29th of January, 1944, witnessed one of the war's most one-sided aerial victories when Fighting Squadron 6 from Intrepid encountered a large formation of Japanese land-based bombers attacking the carrier task force near Kwilene. Lieutenant Commander Edward Owen led 16 Hellcats in a series of slashing attacks that methodically destroyed the enemy formation. The Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bombers, called Betty by American forces, carried no armor protection and featured fuel tanks that ignited catastrophically when hit by tracer rounds. Owen's pilots exploited these vulnerabilities ruthlessly, approaching from astern positions where the bombers' defensive guns had limited fields of fire, then triggering short, accurate bursts that set aircraft ablaze. Within 20 minutes, the Americans had destroyed every Japanese bomber without losing a single Hellcat. This engagement typified the brutal efficiency that characterized Hellcat operations. Superior speed allowed pilots to position advantageously, devastating firepower ensured kills with minimal ammunition expenditure, and protective armor brought pilots home even when enemy gunners scored hits. Combat statistics compiled by the Navy Department throughout early 1944 revealed the Hellcat's extraordinary effectiveness. Kill ratios: the number of enemy aircraft destroyed per friendly loss reached 19-1 across all Pacific Fleet squadrons, an unprecedented achievement in aerial warfare. Individual squadrons and pilots exceeded even these remarkable averages during particularly successful engagements. David McCampbell, now commanding Carrier Air Group 15 aboard Essex, developed into one of the war's most successful fighter leaders, combining natural marksmanship with tactical brilliance. His squadron maintained meticulous records, showing that properly employed Hellcat formations could consistently achieve numerical superiority even when outnumbered, simply by exploiting speed and firepower advantages to fragment enemy formations. The naval air campaign expanded dramatically during spring 1944 as American forces prepared for the liberation of the Mariana Islands, bringing them within bomber range of the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimates indicated Japan would commit massive air strength defending this critical strategic position, potentially including veteran units held in reserve since Midway. The coming engagement would test whether Hellcat squadrons could maintain their dominance against Japan's best pilots flying the latest aircraft variants. Admiral Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 with 15 carriers embarked, expressed confidence based on his pilot's proven combat record and the Hellcat's continuing technical superiority. The 19th of June, 1944, dawned clear and hot over the Philippine Sea as American radar operators detected the first waves of Japanese aircraft launching from carriers attempting a decisive engagement with the American fleet. Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 Japanese carriers embarked with over 400 aircraft, hoping to recreate the devastating surprise that had shattered American power at Pearl Harbor. Instead, he was about to experience the most one-sided carrier battle in naval history. Task Force 58 had deployed over 450 Hellcats among its 15 carriers, creating a defensive barrier so dense that Japanese strike packages had virtually no chance of reaching American ships. The radio circuits erupted with urgent transmissions as American fighter directors vectored Hellcat formations toward incoming raids detected. At ranges exceeding 100 miles, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from Essex, intercepted the first Japanese strike wave at 25,000 feet. His pilots estimated the enemy formation contained over 60 aircraft, a mixture of Zero fighters escorting Yokosuka D-4 wide-duty dive bombers. Brewer led his 16 Hellcats into the enemy formation in a diving attack that scattered Japanese cohesion immediately. The Americans employed tactics refined through 2 years of combat: maintain speed, attack in coordinated pairs, never attempt to turn with Zeros but always fight vertically using superior power and structural strength. The ensuing aerial battles spread across hundreds of square miles as additional Hellcat formations joined the engagement. David McCampbell, personally leading his air group, destroyed 5 Japanese aircraft during a single extended engagement that saw him pursuing enemies from 25,000 feet down to wave-top level. His combat report described the Japanese pilots as determined but predictable, employing outdated tactics that might have succeeded in 1942, but proved suicidal against properly trained Hellcat pilots. The Americans destroyed the first strike wave. Almost completely fewer than 20 aircraft survived to attempt attacks on the American fleet, and anti-aircraft fire splashed most of those before they could launch weapons. Japanese carriers launched 3 additional strike waves throughout the day, each meeting the same devastating reception. Fighting Squadron 2 from Hornet intercepted the second wave. Fighting Squadron 8 from Bunker Hill engaged the third, and Fighting Squadron 16 from Lexington destroyed much of the fourth. The pattern remained consistent across all engagements. Hellcats used superior altitude performance to position above enemy formations, dove through initial attacks, exploiting speed advantages, then employed energy tactics to methodically destroy scattered survivors. By sunset on the 19th of June, American pilots had claimed over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 23 Hellcats, most falling to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. Historians would later christen this engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, reflecting the completely one-sided nature of the combat. The following day brought additional triumph as American aircraft located and attacked the Japanese carrier force, sinking 3 carriers and damaging several others. Hellcat pilots provided fighter escort for the striking torpedo and dive bombers and remained overhead as combat air patrol, while American aircraft recovered in darkness, a hazardous procedure that demonstrated the confidence commanders placed in their equipment and personnel. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting force. They would never again launch a major offensive operation. This decisive victory resulted directly from American technological and tactical superiority embodied in the Hellcat and the highly trained pilots employing it. Statistics compiled in the battle's aftermath revealed the unprecedented scope of the American victory. Task Force 58 had destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft, both carrier-based and land-based, during 3 days of combat while losing fewer than 70 American aircraft total. The Hellcat's kill ratio during this engagement exceeded 25-1, demonstrating that the aircraft had reached full maturity as a weapon system. More importantly, the battle validated the entire American approach to carrier aviation. Produce superior equipment in overwhelming quantities, train pilots thoroughly in its employment, then coordinate operations through sophisticated command and control networks that exploited technological advantages like radar and radio communications. The 20th of October, 1944, witnessed American forces returning to the Philippines as General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his famous promise to liberate the islands. Naval support for the invasion required carrier-based air superiority over the vast archipelago, placing enormous demands on Hellcat squadrons operating from Task Force 38's carriers. Japanese defenders had reinforced their Philippine-based air units substantially, recognizing that loss of these strategically vital islands would sever their southern empire from the home islands. The resulting air campaign became the most sustained combat operation in carrier aviation history, with Hellcats flying hundreds of sorties daily against airfields, shipping, and ground targets across the sprawling island chain. Fighting Squadron 15, David McCampbell's squadron, operated continuously throughout the Philippines campaign, demonstrating both the Hellcat's reliability and its pilots' endurance under sustained combat stress. On the 24th of October, McCampbell personally destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft during a single mission, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor and established a record that would never be exceeded by any American pilot in a single engagement. His after-action report described the tactical situation with characteristic modesty. Japanese pilots had attempted to execute a coordinated attack on American carriers. McCampbell and his wingman had intercepted the formation alone due to communication failures, and they had simply employed textbook Hellcat tactics against an enemy whose inferior training and equipment left them defensively helpless. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, spanning the 23rd through the 26th of October, became the largest naval engagement in history and featured Hellcats in both traditional fighter roles and improvised attack missions. When Japanese surface forces threatened to break through to the invasion beaches, carrier air groups launched everything available, including fighters armed with bombs and rockets, to stop the battleships and cruisers. Hellcat pilots discovered their rugged aircraft could absorb tremendous anti-aircraft damage while delivering precision attacks against armored ships. Lieutenant Commander William Dean led Fighting Squadron 20 from Enterprise in repeated attacks against Japanese battleships, his pilots scoring multiple bomb hits that contributed to the enemy forces' eventual retreat. These operations demonstrated the Hellcat's versatility beyond pure air superiority missions. Throughout November and December 1944, carrier air groups maintained relentless pressure on Japanese forces across the Philippines, Formosa, and the Chinese coast. The operational tempo exceeded anything previously attempted, and naval aviation carriers remained at sea for weeks, launching multiple strikes daily while simultaneously maintaining defensive combat air patrols. Hellcat reliability proved decisive during these sustained operations. Maintenance crews consistently achieved aircraft availability rates exceeding 80%, despite the harsh shipboard environment and intensive flight schedules. Engineering features like easily accessible engine cowlings and modular component designs allowed mechanics to perform necessary maintenance rapidly, returning aircraft to combat status with minimal delay. Japanese forces responded to their deteriorating situation with increasingly desperate measures, including the organized employment of kamikaze suicide attacks against American ships. The first deliberate suicide missions occurred in late October 1944, targeting escort carriers supporting the Leyte invasion. Hellcat combat air patrols faced the extremely difficult challenge of intercepting attackers who had no intention of evading or surviving their missions. Traditional fighter tactics assumed enemy pilots valued their lives and would break off attacks when threatened. Kamikaze pilots ignored such threats completely, requiring American fighters to destroy attacking aircraft with absolute certainty before they reached their targets. This mission proved far more difficult than conventional air combat. A pilot might miss the critical killing shot, or an attacker might remain controllable even after sustaining damage that would normally force enemy aircraft to withdraw. The 1st of January, 1945. Found American carrier forces positioned off Luzon, preparing for the invasion of the main Philippine island. Japanese commanders had concentrated remaining air strength over 200 aircraft at fields throughout Luzon, intending a massive kamikaze assault on the American fleet. The resulting attacks tested Hellcat pilots and their aircraft more severely than any previous engagement. Radar operators detected incoming raids at dawn, vectoring combat air patrols toward interception points. Fighting Squadron 4 from Essex engaged the first wave 20 miles from the fleet, their pilots recognizing immediately that these Japanese aircraft intended suicide attacks rather than conventional strikes. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading a 4-plane division, intercepted 8 Japanese aircraft diving toward the carriers. His pilots destroyed 6 before the formation reached the fleet. But the remaining 2 kamikazes penetrated defensive fire and crashed into ships. This pattern repeated throughout the day as multiple raids tested American defenses. Hellcat pilots discovered that kamikaze aircraft often flew low and fast, making them difficult radar targets and challenging gun platforms. The Americans developed counterattactics, emphasizing head-on attacks that destroyed attackers before they could begin their final dives, but these engagements demanded perfect marksmanship and split-second timing. By evening, American pilots had destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft, but kamikazes had damaged multiple ships and killed hundreds of sailors. The kamikaze campaign intensified throughout January and February 1945 as American forces advanced toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese commanders recognized they could no longer win conventional engagements against American air superiority, but believed suicide attacks might inflict sufficient losses to force a negotiated peace. Task Force 58 responded by maintaining ever larger combat air patrols at peak operations. Carriers launched over 100 Hellcats simultaneously for defensive missions, creating multiple defensive layers between Japanese airfields and American ships. This defensive deployment strained pilot endurance as aviators flew multiple 4-hour combat air patrol missions daily, often engaging kamikazes during every sortie. The 19th of February, 1945, marked the beginning of the Iwo Jima campaign, requiring carrier air support for Marine Corps forces assaulting the volcanic island. Hellcats provided close air support for ground forces while simultaneously defending against kamikaze attacks from Japanese bases on the home islands. Fighting Squadron 82 from Bennington pioneered techniques for employing the Hellcat as a ground attack aircraft, using bombs, rockets, and strafing runs to suppress Japanese defensive positions carved into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock. Pilots discovered the Hellcat's stable gun platform characteristics translated directly to ground attack missions. The aircraft could absorb ground fire that would destroy lighter fighters while delivering accurate supporting fire within dangerous proximity to friendly troops. March 1945 brought a new challenge as Task Force 58 launched massive strikes against Japanese home island targets, attacking airfields and industrial facilities in direct preparation for the anticipated invasion of Japan. These operations placed Hellcats over heavily defended enemy territory hundreds of miles from their carriers, testing both aircraft range and pilot navigation skills. Fighting Squadron 9 from Essex flew escort for bomber strikes against Tokyo on the 16th of March, their Hellcats engaging Japanese interceptors over the enemy capital in some of the war's most intense aerial combat. The Japanese defenders included newly formed units equipped with improved fighter variants and flown by pilots who understood their homeland's survival depended on stopping American air attacks. Nevertheless, American pilots maintained their dominance through superior training and equipment. The day's combat produced 50 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 8 Hellcats lost. The 1st of April, 1945, witnessed American forces invading Okinawa, the final stepping stone before Japan itself. The operation triggered the most sustained kamikaze campaign of the war, as Japanese commanders committed every available aircraft to defend this last strategic position. Task Force 58 positioned itself northeast of Okinawa, its carriers launching continuous combat air patrols and strike missions while absorbing repeated suicide attacks. The following 2 months tested Hellcat pilots and their aircraft to the absolute limits of human and mechanical endurance. Pilots flew multiple combat missions daily, often returning to their carriers with aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire or kamikaze debris, only to rearm and launch again within hours. David McCampbell, now serving as commander of Air Group 15 aboard Essex, led his pilots through this final, brutal campaign. By war's end, McCampbell had personally destroyed 34 enemy aircraft, making him the Navy's highest-scoring ace. His squadron had destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft total, losing 21 pilots killed in combat. These statistics reflected both the Hellcat's capabilities and the terrible cost of sustained combat operations. Squadron records preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum reveal that Fighting 15 maintained operational readiness throughout the Okinawa campaign, despite losing nearly one-third of their pilots, a testament to both the men's dedication and their aircraft's reliability. The 15th of August, 1945, brought the war's end as Japan accepted surrender terms following atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hellcats from Task Force 38 flew the final combat air patrols over Tokyo Bay, guarding against any last-minute suicide attacks during surrender negotiations. These aircraft represented the culmination of American naval aviation's wartime evolution from the desperate defensive battles of 1942 to the overwhelming offensive superiority of 1945. The F6F Hellcat had proven itself the most successful fighter aircraft in naval aviation history, destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft in aircraft, while losing only 270 Hellcats to enemy fighters. This 19-to-1 kill ratio had never been approached before and would never be exceeded in aerial combat. Statistical analysis conducted by Navy Department historians after the war revealed the Hellcat's extraordinary contribution to victory. The aircraft equipped 75 fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific War, flying over 66,000 combat missions while destroying more enemy aircraft than all other Navy and Marine Corps fighters combined. Production totals exceeded 12,500 aircraft, with Grumman's manufacturing efficiency ensuring that every carrier task force maintained full fighter complements throughout sustained operations. The Hellcat had transformed carrier aviation from a defensive capability protecting the fleet into an offensive weapon capable of projecting devastating power across thousands of miles of ocean. Individual pilots who had flown the Hellcat from first combat to final victory consistently praised the aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics and robust construction. These traits allowed relatively inexperienced pilots to survive their first combat missions. While they developed the skills needed for long-term survival, veterans noted that the Hellcat never demonstrated the exceptional maneuverability of enemy fighters, nor did it achieve the highest maximum speed of any contemporary design. Instead, it combined sufficient performance in all categories with outstanding reliability and devastating firepower, exactly the characteristics needed for the prolonged maritime war that characterized the Pacific theater. The Hellcat remained in service briefly after the war as the Navy transitioned to jet-powered fighters, but by 1950 most had been retired to reserve squadrons or scrapped. Several survived as museum exhibits, including examples preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. These weathered aircraft represent more than engineering achievement. They embody the determination, skill, and sacrifice of the pilots who flew them into combat when American survival hung in the balance. The F6F Hellcat earned its place in history not through revolutionary innovation but through ruthlessly effective design executed with industrial excellence, proving that wars are ultimately won by soldiers and machines capable of performing brutal missions repeatedly under the worst conditions imaginable.